For centuries, humanity was seen as weak and insignificant, ignored by the galaxy, dismissed by those in power, observed, evaluated, and quietly underestimated. To the Galactic Council, humans were a temporary inconvenience, an energetic but unruly species that had reached the stars far too quickly for its own good. They questioned traditions older than their entire recorded history. They challenged laws they hadn't written. They demanded explanations instead of accepting authority as a natural fact of the universe. That made them troublesome. But troublesome was not dangerous. Human fleets were small and scattered. Their technology was inventive, not refined. Their politics were chaotic, fractured into nations, blocs, corporations, and ideologies that rarely agreed on anything for long. Compared to civilizations that measured time in tens of thousands of years, humanity seemed unfocused and fragile. Council analysts labeled them unstable. Strategists labeled them containable. Archivists labeled them non-critical. And so the galaxy learned to overlook them. When humans spoke too loudly in council chambers, their objections were noted and ignored. When they pushed against regulations that limited their growth, exceptions were denied for their own stability. When they questioned enforcement that seemed selective, they were reminded that wisdom came with age. Humanity was tolerated, not respected. The Council believed this arrangement permanent. A young species would either adapt to the existing order or fracture under the pressure. Both outcomes were acceptable. Control would be maintained either way. That belief was the mistake. Because humanity's weakness was never its size, its age, or its lack of refinement. It was its dependence. Dependent on trade routes controlled by others. Dependent on permissions granted by distant authorities. Dependent on systems designed by civilizations that saw control as synonymous with order. As long as those dependencies existed, humanity could be guided, delayed, and corrected. The Council believed it held the levers that mattered. And for a time, it did. When human expansion accelerated, restrictions followed. When human influence grew uncomfortable, regulations tightened. Each response was subtle, legal, and justified. Humanity was told it was being protected, from instability, from itself, from mistakes it was too young to understand. Many believed it. Some resisted. None yet understood the full cost. What the Council never noticed was how closely humanity was watching in return. How every denied request became a data point. How every selective enforcement revealed structure. How every quiet pressure taught humans exactly where the system could be broken. They assumed humanity would always argue inside the framework provided. They assumed wrong. Because the most dangerous phase of any system is not when it is challenged openly, but when those under it stop arguing and start learning. The Council thought humanity was loud because it was weak. They didn't realize the noise was curiosity. And when that curiosity finally turned inward, when humanity began asking not how to succeed within the Council's control, but what would happen without it, that was the moment control was already lost. The galaxy just hadn't noticed yet. The Galactic Council tightened its grip. Not with fleets or formal declarations, but with regulations, quiet, precise, and suffocating. Humanity was placed under enhanced oversight, a term that sounded protective while granting the Council sweeping authority over every remaining connection humans had to the wider galaxy. Trade was cut. Human shipping licenses were suspended under temporary review. Strategic materials were reclassified overnight, reactor components, advanced alloys, medical compounds, now restricted for reasons of galactic stability. Dockyards delayed clearance until human vessels ran low on fuel. Contracts froze mid-cycle. Credit access disappeared behind audits that never concluded. Supply chains that had taken generations to build unraveled in months. Rights were revoked. Human representatives lost voting privileges. Then speaking rights. Then access to council chambers entirely. Travel permits were restricted. Surveillance requirements were imposed for safety. Council law, ancient, flexible, and selectively enforced, was suddenly applied with ruthless consistency. Every action was legal. Every justification flawless. Every appeal denied. Humanity protested through the channels that still existed. They cited treaties signed in good faith. Mutual defense clauses. Wars fought side by side. Human fleets had bled alongside Council armadas. Human engineers had rebuilt worlds not their own. The Council acknowledged the petitions, then archived them. Sanctions tightened further. Insurance guilds raised transit costs until civilian travel became impossible. Navigation beacons along human routes went dark for maintenance. Communication relays lagged, then failed, as service contracts quietly expired. Humanity was pushed into isolation, and the Council watched carefully. They expected collapse. They had seen this pattern countless times. A species dependent on interstellar trade fractured quickly once cut off. Economies failed. Political rivalries turned violent. Colonies turned on one another as resources dwindled. Refugees spilled outward, begging for reinstatement and protection. Humanity, with its endless arguments and visible divisions, should have shattered first. It didn't. Months passed. Then years. There were no refugee armadas. No mass distress calls. No desperate broadcasts pleading for forgiveness. Instead, human traffic rerouted inward with unsettling coordination. Peripheral colonies, once dismissed as marginal, became centers of activity. Energy output rose instead of falling. Manufacturing intensified rather than collapsed. Council analysts flagged the data as anomalous. Supervisors dismissed it. They assumed humanity was burning through reserves in a final, desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. Dying civilizations often appeared productive just before the end. It fit precedent. It fit expectation. Then human space went quiet. Not the chaotic silence of collapse, but something deliberate. No protests. No threats. No appeals. To the Council, that silence meant confirmation. Finished. Monitoring files were closed. Observers reassigned. Humanity was quietly reclassified as non-viable, another cautionary example for younger species who might one day challenge the established order. The Council moved on. They never asked why human energy output spiked before the silence. Never questioned why industrial activity intensified instead of declined. Never wondered why a supposedly dying civilization stopped asking for help altogether. They never considered that humanity had reached a conclusion of its own. That dependence was weakness. That permission was vulnerability. That survival required removing every lever others could pull. The Council believed isolation was a punishment. What they failed to see was that, in tightening its grip, it had already lost control. Because humanity was no longer struggling to remain part of the system. They were learning how to exist without it. Isolation didn't break humanity. It unified them. At first came confusion. Then anger. Then a cold, steady clarity that spread faster than panic ever could. When the last Council trade routes closed and the final appeals vanished into administrative silence, humanity reached the same conclusion across every world it had ever settled. No one was coming. For centuries, humanity had carried its fractures into the stars. Old nations reborn as colonies. Corporations wielding power rivaling governments. Ideologies exported wholesale to planets that had never known Earth. Those divisions survived because the galaxy allowed them to, because trade softened consequences and external authority absorbed the cost of failure. Isolation stripped that illusion away. When shipments stopped, ideology didn't matter. When jump routes vanished, borders became irrelevant. When Council patrols ignored human distress calls, denial gave way to understanding. Division was no longer inefficient. It was fatal. Old divisions vanished, not through conquest or revolution, but necessity. Arguments that once dragged on for decades were resolved in days. Sometimes hours. Not because humanity suddenly agreed, but because survival demanded cooperation. You either worked together, or you didn't survive. Emergency coordination assemblies formed across human space. Not parliaments. Not senates. Survival councils. They were led not by career politicians, but by people who understood systems. Logisticians who knew how to keep supply chains alive. Engineers who knew what failed first under pressure. Medics who knew what shortages actually killed people. The questions were brutally simple. How do we feed everyone? How do we keep power stable? How do we make sure no colony stands alone? Corporations resisted at first. Profit collapsed without external markets. Some attempted hoarding, leveraging scarcity for control. They didn't last. Cooperative networks outpaced them within months, sharing materials, labor, and data freely, producing more with less waste. Profit was replaced with continuity. Military forces followed. Fleets that once answered to different flags began operating together out of necessity. Joint patrols became shared commands. Shared commands hardened into permanent structures. Uniforms lost insignia. Ship hulls lost ownership markings. Culture remained. Identity remained. Authority changed. All colonies stood under one command. It wasn't declared. It wasn't voted on. It emerged. Command was not a government. It did not dictate belief, language, or culture. It coordinated survival. When command issued a directive, it was followed, not out of loyalty, but because it worked. Power grids synchronized across systems. Food production stabilized despite shrinking inputs. Manufacturing standards unified so that a failure in one system could be repaired by another without delay. A ship built in one sector could be serviced in any other. Medical protocols standardized across worlds. Mortality rates dropped even as resources tightened. Redundancy replaced efficiency. Resilience replaced optimization. Humanity stopped functioning like competing states. They began functioning like a single organism. Education shifted almost overnight. Children learned systems thinking before history. Emergency response before politics. Every human learned something practical: fabrication, repair, medicine, logistics. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This wasn't militarization. It was preparation. Because if no one else would protect them, they would protect themselves. Defense replaced borders. Early warning arrays stretched far beyond mapped space, watching vectors no council doctrine had ever considered threats. Humanity assumed betrayal as baseline. They assumed isolation would return. They assumed help would not arrive in time. So they built accordingly. The galaxy never noticed. Council observers had been reassigned. Sensor coverage reduced. Reports hinting at unusual coordination were buried under bureaucracy or dismissed as statistical noise. Humanity faded from relevance exactly as the Council expected. And humanity did nothing to correct that assumption. They had learned the value of being underestimated. While the Council congratulated itself on restored order, human space grew quieter and stronger. Colonies once separated by light years functioned like neighboring districts. Decisions that once took generations were made in days. Not through tyranny. Through shared responsibility. Isolation had done what centuries of diplomacy never could. It removed the illusion that someone else would step in. In its place, humanity built unity not from ideology, but necessity. Not from obedience, but trust. And when the galaxy eventually turned its attention back toward the region it believed was under control, it would discover that control had already slipped away. Not through rebellion, but through unity born in silence. In silence, humanity evolved. Cut off from the galaxy's constant oversight, human space did not wither, it refined itself. Without outside approval to chase or scrutiny to perform for, progress became brutally honest. Every innovation had to justify its existence. Every system had to work under failure, scarcity, and isolation. New engines came first. Humanity abandoned the galaxy's dependence on sanctioned travel, hyperspace lanes, fold corridors, and jump gates controlled by external authorities. Those systems were fast, elegant, and fragile. Once denied access, they became liabilities. Humans chose inevitability instead. They built engines that pushed directly against spacetime itself. Drives that relied on no lanes, no gates, no permissions. Slow by council standards. Inefficient. Punishing on materials. But they worked. Human ships could travel anywhere space existed. Not quickly, but unavoidably. Distance became a challenge, not a barrier. Blockades lost meaning. Isolation became optional. Unbreakable shields followed. Not the refined energy veils favored by Council fleets, but layered defenses built on redundancy. Fields stacked inside fields. Physical mass reinforced energy dispersion. Adaptive systems treated incoming damage as information to be learned from rather than force to be negated. Human shields did not try to cancel attacks. They endured them. Energy bled away. Kinetic impacts spread and died. Each strike improved the system's response. Failure was not defeat, it was feedback. Hull plating thickened until ships resembled moving continents. Armor wasn't decorative, it was grown, replaced, and grown again. Vital systems were buried beneath ecosystems, farms, water reserves, fabrication bays, medical wards. A ship no longer carried a crew. It carried a population. Human vessels stopped being vehicles. They became habitats that moved. Fleets were built, but not for conquest. There were no banners, no heroic names etched into hulls. Ships were identified by role and redundancy, not legacy. Arc fleets protected populations. Foundry fleets manufactured replacements mid-transit. Defense lattices turned open space into controlled territory rather than battlefields. Every loss was anticipated. Every role replaceable. Every ship expendable, except the people inside. Weapons existed, but they were restrained. Interdiction fields to halt advance. Area denial arrays to make approach catastrophically costly. Precision systems designed to remove threats permanently, not gloriously. Humanity did not build weapons to intimidate. They built them to end danger. Artificial intelligence, once restricted by fear and treaty, was rebuilt under unforgiving rules. No gods. No masters. Partners only. Every system assumed error, deception, and failure as baseline conditions. Human oversight was absolute. Human accountability mandatory. Biology advanced alongside steel. Human physiology adapted quietly. Radiation tolerance increased. Cellular repair accelerated. Immune systems became self-updating networks. Humans didn't become visibly different. They became harder to kill. Generations grew up inside this preparation. Children learned fabrication and repair alongside language. Emergency response was basic education. Knowing how to keep something running became as fundamental as reading. This wasn't militarization. It was survival literacy. Beyond human space, the galaxy remained unaware. The Council was occupied with politics, trade disputes, and congratulating itself on restored control. Data that contradicted humanity's supposed stagnation was filtered, reinterpreted, or quietly discarded. It was easier not to look. And so the galaxy never saw the engines that ignored borders. Never saw shields that endured forces capable of shattering moons. Never saw fleets built not to conquer, but to survive anything that tried. While the galaxy looked away, humanity prepared. Not to return in anger. Not to seek revenge. But to ensure that when control failed, as all rigid systems eventually do, humanity would still be standing. Then a new enemy appeared. There was no formal declaration. No warning vote passed in time. One cycle, the outer systems reported routine traffic and stable borders. The next, those same systems were screaming, and then they were gone. The first world fell in hours. Long-range sensors captured fragments before failing entirely. Violent spatial distortions, fleets emerging without lanes, vessels whose mass readings contradicted their size and whose movement ignored every known limitation of propulsion. The invaders were colossal and asymmetrical, grown rather than built, their hulls shifting as if alive. They called themselves the Dominion. Worlds fell. Council defense fleets mobilized according to doctrine, carefully, procedurally, and far too slowly. They arrived to find debris fields where orbital cities had once hung. Moons were dismantled for raw material. Planetary crusts were split open with industrial precision. Atmospheres burned not as weapons, but as waste heat. The Dominion did not conquer. They harvested. Entire systems were stripped and abandoned, left silent and lifeless. Borders meant nothing. Treaties meant nothing. The Dominion advanced with relentless efficiency, consuming everything useful and discarding the rest. Species were enslaved. Survivors were processed with mechanical indifference. Engineers were implanted with control nodes and forced to maintain Dominion warforms. Soldiers were chemically altered, stripped of identity, and driven back into battle as disposable shock units. Civilian populations were reduced to labor stock, biological components feeding an ever-expanding machine. Those deemed unnecessary were erased. Refugees poured into council space carrying stories too horrific to dismiss. Worlds became emergency processing hubs. Entire cultures vanished, not through massacre, but repurposing. Languages lost. Histories overwritten. Civilizations reduced to output metrics. The galaxy panicked. The Galactic Council convened emergency sessions that stretched on for cycles. Representatives shouted over one another, demanding action while assigning blame. Ancient powers argued jurisdiction. Younger species begged for protection. Military blocs refused to commit fleets without guarantees of reimbursement, territorial concessions, and command authority. The Council argued while systems burned. Votes were proposed. Votes were delayed. Votes were vetoed. Coalitions formed on paper and collapsed in reality. Fleets mobilized too slowly, bound by doctrines designed for limited wars, not extinction. Every decision required consensus, and consensus arrived only after another star went dark. When Council armadas finally engaged the Dominion in force, the outcome was catastrophic. Entire fleets vanished. Flagships were torn apart mid-transmission. The Dominion sacrificed ships freely, learning from every encounter, adapting faster than Council tacticians could respond. Weapons that had once decided wars barely slowed them. Within a few short cycles, the truth became unavoidable. The Council was losing. Worse, they had no plan left. That was when analysts noticed something deeply unsettling. On Dominion expansion maps, there was a void. A vast region of space they did not enter. Not fortified. Not contested. Simply avoided. Advance vectors curved around it. Probes altered course without explanation. Entire Dominion formations diverted as if responding to a threat no one could see. That region aligned with old charts. Human space. The realization spread through the Council chamber like a vacuum breach. Humanity. A species isolated, sanctioned, and written off as irrelevant. A civilization the Council believed it had broken, and yet something about them caused an empire that devoured stars to hesitate. Fear replaced denial. Dormant channels were reactivated. Deprecated frequencies restored. Messages were drafted with careful language, acknowledging past missteps, emphasizing shared extinction-level risk, invoking unity, cooperation, and survival. The first message went unanswered. So did the second. Worlds continued to fall. Finally, stripped of ceremony and pride, the Council broadcast a single, unfiltered transmission across every channel humanity had ever used. "We need your help." The reply came minutes later. Not from an ambassador. Not from a politician. From a calm, steady voice identified only as command. "We know," the voice said. "We've been observing." Relief swept through the chamber. Councilors spoke at once, offering everything that had once been denied: restored rights, full reintegration, permanent seats, shared authority. Concessions withheld for centuries were suddenly on the table. The human voice cut through the noise. "You isolated us," Command said. "You revoked our rights. You believed control equaled stability. What is happening now is the result of that belief." Panic erupted. "If the Dominion wins," a counselor pleaded, "humanity will fall as well." There was a pause, long enough to feel endless. "Yes," Command replied. "Eventually." Hope flickered. "So you'll help." "We didn't say that," the voice answered. "We said we understand the threat." Council displays changed. Data flooded the chamber. Dominion logistics, behavioral models, structural weaknesses mapped with terrifying precision. Entire campaigns already simulated. Failure points identified. Casualty projections calculated to the decimal. Humanity hadn't just been silent. They had been preparing. "We will engage the Dominion," Command said at last. "Because extinction does not respect borders." Relief washed through the chamber. "But understand this," the voice continued, colder now. This is not a rescue. A pause. This is what happens when control fails, and those you dismissed are the only ones who learned how to survive without it. The transmission ended, and as Dominion fleets pushed deeper into Council space, the galaxy finally understood the cost of its certainty. The Council had not merely lost influence over humanity. They had lost control of the only species that had prepared for a war no one else believed could happen. The Council expected forgiveness. They believed desperation rewrote memory. That when extinction stared the galaxy in the face, old betrayals would blur into unfortunate misunderstandings. Humanity, they assumed, would be angry, but relieved. Ready to return. Ready to help. Ready to forget. They were wrong. What the Council found instead was resolve. When long-dormant human channels reactivated, the Council chamber erupted into frantic order. Delegates spoke over one another, rushing to offer what had once been denied: restored rights, permanent council seats, shared military authority, emergency governance powers. Concessions withheld for centuries were placed on the table in minutes. Humanity listened. There were no counter-demands. No speeches. No visible emotion. Then the reply came, calm and level. We will decide when to act. The words landed like a vacuum breach. Council representatives protested immediately. Time was running out. Every delay meant another world stripped, another species enslaved. They demanded timetables, fleet movements, guarantees, anything that restored the illusion of command. They were given none. Urgency did not save you, the human voice continued, identified only as command. It blinded you. We will not repeat that failure. The transmission ended. Silence filled the chamber, heavy, unfamiliar, and terrifying. For the first time in recorded history, survival no longer rested on ancient authority or collective vote. It rested on the judgment of a species the Council had already written off, and that species was not rushing. Far beyond charted space, something began to move. In regions long labeled empty, where gravity maps blurred and sensor returns dissolved into static, human constructs awakened. Structures seeded during the earliest days of isolation came online in flawless synchronization, responding to signals that had never been broadcast. Foundries ignited. Stars were tapped, not consumed, not destroyed, but disciplined. Their output redirected into controlled torrents of energy feeding colossal frameworks wrapped in reinforced spacetime fields. Fleets long hidden aligned along vectors no Council doctrine had ever charted. Soon after, space itself began to tremble. Not from hyperspace ruptures. Not from weapons fire. From strain. Across the galaxy, sensors screamed as localized distortions appeared in repeating patterns light-years apart. Reality flexed, stabilized, then flexed again, like a structure being tested far beyond its intended limits. Humanity was not mobilizing. They were initializing. The Council finally understood the difference. Whatever humanity was preparing was not a reaction to the Dominion. It was not fear. It was not desperation. It was a solution conceived long ago, refined in silence, and held in reserve for the moment when control failed everywhere else. The Dominion qualified. Whether the Council did, was no longer relevant. Humanity had not returned seeking forgiveness. They had not emerged to reclaim status or authority. They had returned because something now existed that threatened continuity itself. And when they finally acted, it would not be because the Council asked. It would be because humanity had finished deciding how the galaxy would survive, and what the cost of losing control truly was. Human fleets emerged in perfect silence. There was no flash of entry, no hyperspace rupture, no warning spike for sensors to catch and scream about. One moment, Dominion armadas filled the void, vast, predatory formations advancing toward the last remaining Council strongholds. The next moment, humanity was there. Space did not tear open. It yielded. Colossal human constructs unfolded along vectors the Dominion had never considered vulnerable. Arc ships the size of small moons anchored the formation, their gravity wells stabilizing surrounding space. Vast lattice structures stretched across entire approach corridors, turning open void into controlled terrain. Foundry fleets aligned behind them, already fabricating replacements for losses that had not yet occurred. They were massive. They were precise. They were unstoppable. Human vessels emitted nothing recognizable. No engine flare. No weapons charging. Dominion targeting systems returned contradictory data, range without mass, mass without location, as if the human fleet existed slightly outside the rules the Dominion obeyed. They did not advance. They waited. Then a single message crossed every channel. Unencrypted. Unfiltered. Translated instantly into every known language. Stand down. The Dominion answered with annihilation. Entire formations surged forward, sacrificing themselves to breach the human line. Planet cracker lances fired. Reality-warping weapons detonated. Space burned white as the Dominion unleashed everything it had ever used to erase resistance. The human fleet did not move. Their shields flexed, layered systems absorbing, dispersing, and nullifying forces that had shattered stars. Energy bled away into harmless radiation. Kinetic impacts slowed, spread, and died. Human hulls did not glow. Armor did not fracture. Humanity endured. Then they responded. Not with fury. With correction. Regions of space hardened. Dominion ships slowed, then stopped entirely, trapped in volumes where physics itself refused to cooperate. Propulsion systems failed. Weapons shut down mid-cycle. Entire fleets froze mid-charge like insects suspended in amber. Human counterfire began. It was not a barrage. It was removal. Dominion vessels vanished one by one, erased by localized null events that left no debris, no explosion, only absence. Command ships disappeared first. Control nodes followed. Each strike removed something essential, unraveling the Dominion structure with surgical inevitability. The Dominion attempted to adapt. They always did. But there was nothing to adapt to. Human tactics did not escalate. They did not change. They remained constant, methodical, executing a solution calculated long before the first ship appeared. Retreat vectors collapsed before they could be used. Reinforcements never arrived. Communication across Dominion formations degraded into static, then silence. Then the Dominion's command intelligence, an entity believed to span multiple dimensions, went dark. No death cry. No final transmission. It simply stopped. The war ended before the enemy understood it had begun. Across the galaxy, Council sensors struggled to process what they were witnessing. Battles predicted to last centuries concluded in minutes. Systems once marked for extinction went quiet, not conquered, not occupied, but spared. Human fleets did not pursue. They powered down. A final transmission followed, brief and absolute. The threat has been neutralized. Do not pursue remnants. And then humanity withdrew. Space relaxed. Physics resumed its familiar shape. Human ships vanished as cleanly as they had arrived, leaving behind stunned silence, and survivors who barely understood why they were still alive. The galaxy had expected a war. What it witnessed instead was something far more unsettling. Proof that when the Council lost control of humanity, it did not unleash chaos. It unleashed an ending. The Council tried to reclaim control. In the aftermath of the Dominion's annihilation, emergency sessions filled the ancient chambers once again. Borders were reaffirmed. Authority was restated. Committees formed to oversee reconstruction, security realignment, and post-crisis governance. The Council spoke as if order had been preserved, as if the galaxy had survived because the system had ultimately worked. It was too late. The galaxy remembered. Worlds remembered how long they burned while debates continued. Species remembered the promises that arrived after extinction was already at their doors. Survivors remembered who hesitated, and who arrived without asking permission. The Council still had fleets. They still had laws. They still had history measured in millennia. But control was gone. Humanity did not step forward to rule. They refused every offer. Permanent council seats. Supreme military authority. Oversight of liberated systems. Each proposal was received, evaluated, and declined with the same calm finality. "We are not here to govern," came the final human transmission. Governance creates dependence. Dependence creates failure. Instead, humanity shared what it had learned in silence. Defensive architectures designed to prevent extinction, not to project power. Stabilization systems capable of restoring worlds thought permanently lost. Infrastructure built on redundancy rather than efficiency, resilience rather than elegance. They helped rebuild. Then they left. Humanity did not dismantle the Council. They made it optional. Across the galaxy, something subtle and irreversible changed. Species stopped assuming someone else would protect them. Defense replaced prestige. Preparation replaced complacency. The illusion that safety could be delegated to ancient authority began to fade. The Council still existed, but it no longer defined survival. And humanity, they faded back into the dark. Not hiding, not isolated, waiting. Human space remained distant and undefined, its borders unmapped, its fleets unseen. They did not occupy trade routes. They did not demand recognition. They existed beyond certainty, where sensors strained and assumptions failed. Watching, listening, enduring. The Council never again spoke of controlling humanity. They never dared. Because the galaxy now understood a truth that could not be voted away, regulated, or forgotten. Humanity did not need to rule to matter. They did not need permission to act. They did not need gratitude to protect existence. They had survived abandonment. They had endured isolation. They had ended an extinction-level threat without becoming conquerors. And that redefined power forever. So when the stars finally grew quiet, when the Dominion became memory instead of terror, one certainty spread across the galaxy, whispered between worlds and etched into every serious archive. If darkness rises again, if something ancient, merciless, or unimaginable reaches for the stars, humanity will be there. Not as rulers, not as saviors seeking praise, but as the ones who learned how to survive. After control was lost.